Hey everyone, welcome to the Speed Secrets podcast. Today I'm talking with Andrew Rains. And again, Andrew, you've been on once or twice now. I should know that, but we've had these conversations on this podcast before.
Yeah, I believe this is round number 3.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Jeez, so welcome back again. Things have changed. Things are kind of weird right now.
It's an odd time.
Yeah, really odd time. And obviously, us in our little motorsport world, I keep thinking about it and going, geez, these are really first world problems. There are people that have we complain about an event being canceled and there are people that are a lot worse situation than we are. So how are you managing all of this stuff?
It's adapting on a daily basis. But it's, I keep trying to have that same perspective, and staying in touch with friends who, are more affected, as far as the real kind of nuts and bolts of the economic, system goes, and trying to stay informed about, what's happening. But it is tough, and at the end of the day, we're in our world and we make a living from this world. So it's important, but definitely a lot of greater issues out there. But we're getting by. We're doing a lot of webinars and providing content about using your Apex Pro, because we don't really have a way to go record new data. So might as well learn how to use the data that you have. So that's our focus right now.
And that's something that I want to talk about because, obviously there's this is a nasty world at the moment, but, or maybe a very friendly world in some ways, the way people are helping. But more importantly, I want to talk more about that. And, you talk about looking at data and maybe just for people that have forgotten, because it's been a while, since I've done the podcasts and since you've been on. Your background, obviously you work, well, not obviously, but, you work with Apex Pro. You've been involved with that from the day one. Give us a little background there, but maybe more, also tell us about your driving background and instructing background and things.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. People that know me know that I don't mind talking. So, I happily will discuss it, but I got involved in the crazy world of motorsports because a guy I sat next to in home ec had a Honda Civic that he autocrossed, and asked me to join him. So I went and won like the novice group and top packs and all this stuff. That first weekend, and that started the slippery slope. My dad was a car guy. Always went. I grew up going to Road Atlanta. I think we talked on our first episode that I was at the first 2 or 3 Petite Le Mans, where you were probably driving.
Yep. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. A long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a fan forever, and grew up. My parents' house is like less than 5 miles from the entrance of Barber Motorsports Park in Birmingham. They live in a neighborhood back there. So it was like a racetrack was put in my backyard. So I didn't really have an excuse to not get into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing that you proved there is, for anybody that said, why would anybody take home ec in school? Well, you just prove there's value in it. It gets you driving.
Yeah, that's right. It's more valuable than just making brownies.
Yeah, there you go. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you talked about Apex Pro, and you talked about how, right now we can't go out and get data, fresh data, but it's possible to kind of come back and look at what you've got from the past and learn from that. Let's spend a little time just talking about that, because I'm sitting here looking at all sorts of data from the past as well and trying to get better prepared to help some of the coaching clients that I work with. So tell me how you go about that, and what would you suggest people do that have some data and now have a little bit of time to really dig into it where maybe they haven't in the past?
Sure. Yeah. Now is really the perfect time to really familiarize yourself with the software, and, with so much uncertainty about events and stuff coming up, specifically for, looking at certain data is kind of hard. You don't know if you can go to your next event at whatever track. So you're not sure if you should be looking at that data or other data, but I think it's probably the best time ever to invest in your learning process, with data, because there's definitely a lot more resources that have been developed in the past year or so that can help you learn. And whether it's a a webinar like we're doing, or just, watching YouTube videos, and participating in some of the stuff that you offer. I think that's probably the best starting point. And also just kind of acknowledging, where you are in your data journey, and then kind of what your goals are, is the biggest thing. That's like in everything in life and business and driving, it's all goal based. So defining your goal is kind of where it starts. And hey, I want to go do this. I want to get to this lap time at this racetrack, or maybe I just want to get more comfortable driving my car at the limit, or I want to find the limit and learn what the limit is. Or maybe I'm racing, I'm competing for a regional or a national championship. So defining kind of what that goal is, and then kind of working backwards from there. So it's a little different, for each individual. I know that's not a fantastic answer, but, and then I always suggest to people, regardless of the system that you're using, in my opinion, the first thing to understand is what I would call the big three, data channels, which would be the speed trace, longitudinal G-forces, and lateral G-forces, and what they look like, overlaid on a track map image, on a GPS image, and what they look like as graphs. And if you can, kind of quiz yourself and learn, oh yeah, that's long G, that's lat G, that's a speed trace, and you can look for shapes and make some, simple analysis, assessments off of the shapes of those. I think that's a really good thing to focus on, right now while we've got some downtime. And then from there, you can kind of move on to some of the next steps. But that's what I would suggest, the big three.
So kind of going back to the beginning there, one of the things that you point out, I think, is super critical is, when we're at the track, one of the things that I see a lot of drivers, the challenge they have when they're at the track is they don't have enough time. They get out of the car and, the session is either, an hour later or 4 hours later, or whatever, but they've got put fuel in the car, get a drink, get something to eat, talk to their buddies. There's all those things in between that compete for that time. And a problem or a challenge or an excuse I hear drivers make is, I just don't have time to look at my data. Well, part of it is that they haven't gotten so familiar with it that they're able to just jump into it and go boom, boom, boom. And even knowing, and personally, I have a challenge with, because from one weekend to the next, I could be looking at Apex Pro data, Motec, to AIM, to Race Logic, to whatever, right? I'm looking at other, and every single time it's kind of like, where's the button to make it do that again? I got to think about that. And so the more familiar I get with where things are in the software, it just speeds up the whole process. And it gets to the point where I can just boom, boom, boom. I know exactly what I'm going to look at. So maybe now getting familiar with the software, but kind of, working on the process that you would look at and pretending like, okay, I've got 15 minutes to look at data. How best am I going to use this 15 minutes? And almost simulate that and practice it now. And then kind of digging in, like you said, into the big three and going boom, boom, boom. There we are.
Yep. Yeah, that's an awesome point. I love that discussion about being familiar enough with the software that it's not a barrier. Because when I think about, I don't love using Excel, and I think about having to record different things in a spreadsheet, and I kind of put it off because I don't really like using the software, and it's kind of irritating. And I think that's what a lot of people end up with, for better or for worse, with data. It's a lot of fun to record the data, obviously, and have it, but then it's really easy to kind of just go, well, I can look at it later. But so now's that time, you're right, to really be intimately familiar with the software that you're using. And I think multiple softwares, if you can be bilingual, it helps. If you speak French and German and Italian, then you probably understand the other languages a little better. So
yeah,
if you're using multiple systems or you have access to them, I think that's a really good thing as well. But yeah, being able to start off, and then something we've talked about before, and that's really important, and kind of maybe the spin on the product that we're really trying to go for. And I say spin as in just how it's presented and what we want people to get out of it is more of a coaching tool as opposed to just a data system. So that kind of involves around like our webinar series and how we talk about using the product. And so something that I spent a while talking with about 20 folks on Wednesday on a webinar was, If your speed trace has a curve at the top consistently into corners where you're supposed to be transitioning off the throttle onto the brake as quick as you can, then that's all you need to be able to identify and then go fix it. You don't really have to go any further. So it's having kind of a process for, okay, I'm coasting a little bit before I brake. Let me go fix that before I work on my brake release or before I work on, driving the car at the limit mid corner or whatever else. I think that helps a lot too.
So, unfortunately, podcasts are not very visual. So it would be wonderful if we had some lines on a screen in front of us and you could point to those things. But can you just kind of go back and try to explain what you were just talking about there, and then maybe kind of dig into a little bit? I'm going to push you here for a little bit of the big three. Like, what are some trends that I should go and start watching for? And if you just kind of try to paint the picture of what those lines look like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of it comes down to, when you really critically think about what you're doing too. And you don't necessarily need data to identify it. It just really helps because it's more illustrative and simple. But when I say like the curvy top of the speed trace, that's kind of the word I like to use. You're looking at a speed, versus distance graph, and every system's going to provide that. It's the most, fundamental part of data is going to be that speed trace. And so what you're looking for is that curve at the top of those kind of humps as you go through the track, right? Your Vmax, your highest speed is where the speed trace is the highest. The graph is literally the tallest. It looks like a mountain coming out of the ground. If that mountain's got a curved top to it, that probably indicates your transition from wide open throttle to brake application is a little lazy. It's not happening quick enough, and we know from just understanding physics and what we've learned through, our progression and people that we've been around, that we don't want to waste any time on that transition from wide open throttle to braking. And so that's what that curve usually represents. And I think sometimes it's easy to see that and also maybe go too far the other way and go, oh man, I'm releasing the throttle and then I'm waiting and then I'm going to the brake pedal. But usually what happens and what I see most often and what I hear from drivers when we're talking through it is that they just relax off the throttle. But they transition immediately to the brake. They're just releasing the throttle slowly. So that right foot's kind of curling back off the gas pedal.
It's funny because we so often tell people to be smooth with the throttle. Well, there's one place where you don't want to worry about being smooth with the throttle, and that's the release of it approaching a brake zone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's like, and you say this all the time on the podcast on previous episodes, but it's like, yeah, and that is true, like 99.9% of the time. But there are those cases where the topography is working against you, or the car is diabolical when the weight transfers forward too aggressively, or whatever it is, where you do have to be smoother. But, more than 99% of the time, you just chop off that throttle. And I like to call it a sign off. You should hear the exhaust kind of have a crisp, especially, if you have a stock exhaust on your car, you might not notice it. But if you're driving something that has a distinctive exhaust note, I like to listen for what I call a sign off, which is where you hear that exhaust go from, kind of a whop, and it just stops immediately. Yeah. And that's a really good sign that you're just coming straight off of that. So I like to use the data to support those other kind of more subjective measures. Because that's a trackside thing. If you're coaching a guy in a loud car, Ross, you can stand trackside and hear that, exhaust note change.
Well, and thanks for bringing up that whole thing of there are no rules in this sport, right? There are times where, I just finished saying you should come off the throttle quickly. Well, you point out there are some places where you don't want to do that. I'm going to say, particularly places where you're going to brake in while turning into a corner. I think about, the entry into turn one at Daytona. Yeah, you can be pretty quick depending on the car you're driving. But some cars, you've got steering angle in the car as you go to the brakes. So maybe you don't want to be quite so abrupt coming off the throttle. Does that make sense? But yeah, in a place where it's pretty much a straight line, you're going to go from throttle to brake. That should be a pretty quick, abrupt let go. Again, maybe if there's some quick elevation change, popping up over the top of the hill, going into the corkscrew at Laguna Seca is another example where depending on the
Yeah.
car, depending on where you're coming off the throttle and onto the brakes, maybe there you want to be a little bit more gentle, smooth with it, but not slow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. I love those corner specific examples too, because that really jogs every, when I talk to drivers specifically, especially when addressing like a large group, talking about, specific examples and different tracks. And I think the main thing to think about with that sign off is it's the vast majority of braking zones. And part of the hard thing about that kind of coasting dynamic is, especially when you're a fairly advanced driver, and I'm speaking to folks that are, running in the top group of their DE region. You usually are really comfortable carrying corner speed, and you're usually really comfortable with threshold braking. The hardest thing to be comfortable with, I think, as it pertains to that throttle sign off and release of the throttle, is when you're going to like, a 3 out of 10 on the brake pedal, just like a balance. Maybe you're going into a fast corner, and you're just squeezing it. And I think that's the hardest thing. At least that definitely was for me, and still is something that I really have to fight and work on, with my feet to be disciplined. But it's that super quick release off the throttle and immediate brake application, but you can't stomp the pedal to the floor. You got to go right to the amount that you want. I think that is where it gets really tricky. So if you're an advanced driver in your DE group, that might be something to just mentally think about, while you're at home. Think about that fast corner where you're trying to balance the car's chassis, and you're maybe, placed like turn 1 at Road Atlanta, or, any high speed kind of fast corner like that, turn 10 at VIR. Lots of examples, turn 1 at Mid Ohio, places like that where, especially in a slower car, you're not really braking a whole lot. It's just more of a weight transfer and maybe 15, 20 mile per hour speed decrease to get the car into the corner. I find that to be really challenging, but that's easy to measure in the data as well. So that's
having recently been at Barber Motorsport Park for a WRL race and seeing you drive there. You obviously know how to do it because you're stinking fast. It was fun watching you out there.
Thanks. Good times.
And Barber's got some great examples of that too, where, some places where you need to be good, a 10 pedal on the brakes, and other places where maybe you want to be a 7 pedal or a 3 pedal. How do you know? I mean, can you look at the data and go, yeah, I should be at a 5 pedal, not a 6 pedal here. And just, for people that are maybe most drivers or many drivers have heard kind of this whole concept of, a 10 pedal or a 1 pedal or a 3 pedal or whatever. But 10 is a threshold braking, just tickling the ABS, let's say, that's a 10. 1 is a barely brushing the brakes. And so you kind of just put a number on that, and it kind of helps calibrate your driving. But can you look at data and go, I'm using a 5 pedal now, I think I should be at a 4 pedal? Can you use data to help you with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I find the best way to do it when you're using the type of system that most of us have, which is going to be, you're going to have the big 3. You might have some other data channels like throttle position. Maybe if you're lucky, you've got a car with, CAN that's enabled for brake, either brake position or brake pressure. But the big thing for me in doing that and in measuring that is the combination of the speed trace and the longitudinal G graph, and looking at the two of those together. And then I also really like to lean on the friction circle for that sort of thing as well, because the friction circle, if you haven't spent much time learning, what it is or the significance of it, it's probably the simplest way to answer the question, am I driving the car at the limit? And it's kind of the foundation of what the Apex score metric is built on. It's basically a modified friction circle that takes into account things that influence the friction circle that aren't accounted for by a friction circle. You can't always be cornering at peak lateral cornering ability. Physics tells us that, right, with road conditions and things like that. But
so
I like
to clarify that would be maybe a track surface change so that it doesn't have the same grip level, or crest of a hill, that kind of thing. Is that what you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're braking, as the hill as a hill is cresting, and the track is flattening, meaning you're going from an uphill track to a flat track, and the surface has that change, and you brake, approximately at that crest or maybe after the crest, you're not going to be able to achieve the same G force and deceleration force as you would on the hill. And so while the friction circle is a very ones and zeros kind of, here is what you did at this point on the track as far as acceleration goes. Here's how many G's you were pulling here, in both lateral and longitudinal. Apex score looks at it a little bit more by measuring the frequencies of accelerations and things that you can measure with a 9-axis unit of measurement, a 9-axis accelerometer, that you can't with just a lateral and longitudinal accelerometer, a standard 3-axis. So it understands that a little bit more, and I think that helps diagnose and look at those brake application situations like you were talking about. And Barber's a good example for that. We obviously, if you follow Apex Pro, you see a lot of Barber examples because it's 20 minutes from our office. But every track in the country that you're going to drive on has, not every corner is threshold braking. And for safety, we're all taught at our first HPDE that we brake in a straight line and then squeeze into the corner, and that usually kind of evolves into hard braking everywhere. And then as you get faster, you start to realize it's not just about braking super late and hard. There's some more elements to it. And so I like to use, I use longitudinal G a lot. And the simple metric for me is overlaying longitudinal G on a track map. If I'm really pressed for time, that's probably the quickest and easiest thing to look at. And you understand what the color scale means, because it'll, all systems will let you do that, where you can color like the track map by longitudinal G, and usually red or some dark color is braking and some lighter color is accelerating. And that's really, really easy to see. One, if you're coasting, if you're lifting off the gas and, creating that curvy speed trace. But two, it'll let you see if you're braking really hard, too hard for a corner that's pretty fast. And usually you just see, like in Apex Pro, hard braking's red. If you see red hard deceleration for a very, very short period of time entering a pretty fast corner, you're probably applying too much brake. And that's a really, really simple way to look at it. There's more to it than that to, kind of analyze it. And then I call it tactical decision making, which is coming up with a tactic to go apply to fix it. But that's what I look for. If you see that little short distance of hard red braking into a fast corner, that, you might be able to soften that up. That's usually the first place that I go. Soften that brake application up, or there's a million different ways you can go from there. It also might be exactly what you need to be doing. So there are no rules.
Well, and that brings up a good point, I think, in that the data tells you what you did, but it doesn't tell you why you did it. And you might be braking super hard because, boy, this is a scary fast corner and I want to slow this thing down. So I think, it's then trying to use the data. The data isn't going to tell you always exactly what to do. So, but it's the tool that leads you to the end result of understanding the why. The example you use of approaching a fast corner that probably could get away with, let's say, a 5 pedal, but you're braking at a 9 pedal. I suspect that there is some intimidation going on there. And in which case, in my experience, a lot of times, so the sooner you as a driver understand that that's probably it, that intimidation part. And what I see a lot of drivers do at that point is intimidation, fear, we'll call it even fear, in a fast corner. For whatever reason, physiologically, our eyes tend to drop. And yet, if we can get our eyes up and look through the corner, all of a sudden it doesn't look quite so scary anymore. We're not quite as intimidated. So maybe the way to fix I need softer brakes is to look further ahead. Kind of the knowing where you're going kind of a thing. But then also having the data afterwards again, or during, to kind of say, yes, you're heading in the right direction. That's a useful thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the vision component can't be understated, because it's really the first place to start for everything. and using data to support, making a change with your vision habits or starting to change your vision habits is really important. And we talked a little bit about some of this type of stuff in one of our previous conversations on the podcast about kind of the psychology of data. And it's a really interesting thing to kind of think through. But the vision part is for most of us, and I'm 100% in this boat. I only get to race wheel to wheel in anger maybe 3 to 5 times a year if I'm lucky. I get to drive a lot on the track and ride a lot and look at a lot of data, but I'm only out there for myself to improve myself as a driver a handful of times a year, and that's more often the case than not with most coaches. Some have more consistent opportunities, but the constant thing that I'm always working on is vision, and that's usually what I'm finding in the data is, especially if I'm at a track that I'm not as familiar with and a corner that is faster, that's a little intimidating. I think your whole kind of approach about learning a new track, figuring out the fast corners first, is a really good approach because you have to be familiar with those fast corners. Because they're the higher risk ones. They're the ones that are going to take longer to learn. So if you really focus your learning on those, the slower corners kind of come together. But that's usually where the vision is more of a challenge. So I'm always fighting. The first 10 laps of the WRL race I hadn't driven in several weeks, and so it was just constantly reminding myself in the car of where I need to be looking, and beyond just looking up as well as going back to some specific references or changing your references, where exactly are your eyes going? And that's something that I had to work on a lot because I always felt that as long as my vision was up and ahead of the car, that I was doing what I needed to do. And then I was kind of working on the mechanics and thinking about my brake release and other stuff like that. But I've recently found that I've got to get really specific with where I look if I want to be really fast and consistent and put the car exactly where I want it. And I use the data sometimes to help me with that, just based on that kind of psychological component. Oh, I'm slowing down too much here. I'm too aggressive on the brake, and I don't need to be. And I think you saw our car at the race, but we just put aero on it for the first time with no testing, the true grassroots way to do it.
Yeah.
And, so it was a different car. I mean, it was way more confidence inspiring in the fast stuff. So all my references for the fast corners, I was looking at some of the data. Earlier, I did a quick Facebook Live video showing the data, but in turn 12 at Barber, it's a fast left-hander. Yeah. I was consistently 7 miles per hour faster at the apex with the aero than without.
Which takes some getting used to, right?
Yeah, it's totally different. And I spoke to Mike Lewin with Professional Awesome, who does they sell aerodynamic components, and he also does a lot of consulting. And he and I were talking about, and we're having another conversation about this soon, about how, probably half of that, maybe a little more than half, was actually the physical, the physics of the car and the tire being able to, to handle more with the aero load and all those things. But the other part of it was probably just me feeling more confident.
Right.
Being able to put the car there.
Well, as you're talking about, I'm thinking, okay, when we can get a data system that actually plugs into our eyes, and we get a graph of where our eyes are looking, that would be really cool. And then the next one will be, it plugs into our belief system and it measures our confidence level. So wouldn't that be cool? If you could then overlay those lines over your speed trace, boy, we would really be learning something then.
Right. I wonder what that graph would look like.
Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting, wouldn't it? If you could measure a person's confidence level. And actually, this kind of leads to, we've spent a bunch of time recently, like at the instructor summit at Road Atlanta, and then the big instructor summit in Indianapolis, because you're doing way more instructing, coaching, and everything. And one of the things that as a coach, you really do start to become pretty good at reading a driver's confidence level, and it's almost like we're the data system for the driver's confidence level.
That's a great way to put it. I think that's a huge reason to have a coach that has that ability, because that's not easy. That's not easy to assess in somebody, but that I definitely experienced that. And I'm sure you did at the WRL race, because we were standing on the tower together on the radio with our respective drivers, my co-drivers in the car. And it was pretty easy, once you watched enough laps and you heard the radio transmissions to get, I don't say easy, but to get that assessment of where their confidence level is. And then as a coach, the hard thing is what information do you provide and when do you provide it? And I think that's what you're really, really good at. It's not easy to do.
It's so that's a big part of it, right? But I think, if there are people listening to this who are HPDE, high performance driver education, because somebody reminded me the other day that not everybody knows what HPDE stands for, high performance driver education instructors, to teach the technique, to say brake now, the line, the turn-in point is here, the apex is over there. Those are all kind of physical things. You can see those things, and yet can you see confidence? And even to some extent, can you see where somebody is looking? And, as an instructor, we kind of talk about, well, look at a person's head movement. Do they turn their head and look through the corner? But there's kind of the physical where they're looking, but where's their mind? And, if you can get to the point where you go, I know this person's thinking about the corner on the other side of that hill, I feel that the driver's in good shape. But if they might be physically looking at the front face of the hill crest, but their mind is even closer to the car than that even, and that's not a good situation. So that's what makes the whole instructing coaching thing fun.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a lot more, like even if we did have our theoretical like eye measurement data system and the confidence meter, you would still struggle to. I don't know how, without humans totally being cyborgs, I don't know how you could measure, what thoughts pass through somebody's head, because I've definitely had weird thoughts, weird random thoughts in a race car before that I'm sure affected my performance, and you don't necessarily know where they come from. Sometimes it's like, sometimes your mind can wander when you're under that much, physical strain and duress, so it's that is the hard part, is figuring out where that person that you're working with, where is their mind going while they're trying to perform in these situations. And that's hard to do. So
your experience as an instructor, and I know that you do all sorts of different levels of instruction and stuff, from helping, I guess, some drivers just sort of experience a track and or a new car or something like that, to, pretty high, very high levels of coaching drivers. Tell me some common, I guess, I don't want to focus on the common mistakes because everybody does that, but what are some, I guess, misconceptions that you've seen? And maybe this is even applies to what are some of the misconceptions about the use of data and or the driving that they're getting themselves into? What have you seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love it. It becomes more apparent how many misconceptions there are out there the more of it that you do, especially being in the position that I'm in, where I get to work with a lot of different people and see a lot of different people's data. And I guess it's the people's understanding of weight transfer. I always am surprised when I hear or ask someone to explain back to me or ask the question, where does the load transfer to in the car when you go to the brake pedal? You're applying the brakes, where there's some, fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. Where do they go? And I try to phrase it and get it as communicative as possible, and I hear a lot of different answers. So it's interesting because I definitely see different misconceptions that come from people, in different areas, or that come up through different organizations, because there's not a ton of standardization around some of those things, and I think you and I and others that do what we do benefit a lot from being around people that deeply understand the craft and what we're doing. So we benefit from being exposed to it. But I think a lot of folks that, particularly if you're only going to the track a couple times a year, it's really easy to have a simple misunderstanding, and just like 180-degree misunderstanding. So sometimes I find that, if there's too many instructors in an organization that tell people what not to do, that those people start to think that is what to do because that's what they hear.
Good point.
And I see that a lot. And I really focus on, and I'm trying to say this in a positive light, because I was going to say I never tell people what not to do, but that's just, then I just said the same thing. So, but I try to focus on the positives, or on the instructional. Here's what happens when we apply the brake pedal with the load in the car, and talking about that, because I find that, and some drivers come from a background where they've been taught the friction circle and what it means, and their first class. So sometimes there isn't a misconception, but definitely just, I would say, weight transfer, misconceptions about how you're loading the car, and how the brake release impacts, the tire contact patches, and that sort of thing. I think that's a big one. I'm sure we all can point to trail braking immediately and go, that's a misconception, because we don't, define that. It's defined in so many different ways. And then the last one, and I'll stop talking because this answer's dragging on.
No,
but
it's great.
I'm glad. It's approaching fast corners. I think there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about how to approach a fast corner, and why I don't want to use the word different. It's not necessarily different than a slow corner. It's just understanding how physics are acting on the car well enough, and thinking about it the right way to understand why your inputs are going to happen in different places than they do in a slow corner. If that makes sense. And then the very final one, because I thought of one more, of course, is
yeah.
I'm driving XYZ car, and that's different than my friend's car, so I have to drive it differently. And I think that's probably the biggest overarching misconception, because I don't know about you, but I pretty much drive everything with 4 tires pretty similarly.
Thank you. Well, and I don't know if you remember or heard it, but I had a conversation with Colin Brown on the podcast a while ago, and Colin's been on a number of times, and we had this conversation about this, and he said, let me use the example of Road Atlanta. He says, at Road Atlanta, I've driven NASCAR Cup cars, I've driven prototype cars, I've driven open wheel cars, I've driven front wheel drive, World Challenge cars. I've driven, he talked about all these different cars. He says, I drive pretty much the same line and the same way in all of them. They all have 4 tires. So I always worry about when somebody says, oh, but I'm driving a so-and-so, so I've got to drive it completely different. There are subtleties, but it's not completely different, right?
Yeah, unless it's a white car, with red stripes, you drive that differently, right?
Well, yeah, we all know that. White cars with red stripes, of course. Yeah.
No, that's funny.
One of the things that, going back, you said that you drive 3, 4, or 5 times a year where you really get a chance, but you're in a car a lot, right? How often would you say that you're in a car? On a track,
pre-coronavirus, definitely different now. Not often now.
Yeah.
At the current moment, taking 2020 as an example, 1, 2, 3. I did, 4 full weekends of in and out of car instruction and/or driving. Just from the beginning of 2020.
Yeah.
So more than once a month.
But
not as much as I used to, unfortunately. But.
The other thing, though, is how often are you looking at data? And maybe the bigger question is, how often are you thinking about track driving?
Oh, probably every single day, more than 6 hours a day. And look, roughly on data, I'm looking at somebody's data at least 2 or 3 times every single day.
Yeah.
And then, thinking about track driving pretty constantly, and definitely when I'm driving on the street, I'm always trying to mimic the inputs that I want to achieve when I'm on the track, and the eye tendencies and everything like that. Not at speed, at street legal speeds. Although now the streets are pretty empty, so
yeah, game on. No, well, and that kind of goes back to the data doesn't data tells you what you did, but not the why. One of the things that you spend a lot of time doing, I'm sure, is thinking about the why. Like you look at the data and you go, why is the driver doing that? And then you think about the tactic of, well, what am I going to do? What is that driver? What am I going to do differently? And then you get on the track for that 3 or 5 times a year, and you don't have to wait for a long period of time to be able to figure out how to do it. You can change your driving on the fly and figure things out more quickly. So, maybe if there's a underlying message to this show, hopefully it's okay, you've got a gap in time before you're back on track, or who knows when this is going to play and where we're going to be. Maybe we're going to be on track next week, but it could be 6 months from now. Who knows? And think about look at your data and think about the why you're seeing what you're seeing. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, that's awesome. You nailed it. I mean, that's the crux of it all, because that's the thing that the data is not going to tell you. And I don't know that it necessarily will ever be able to tell you. We might get closer to that, but really thinking critically about why does this look this way, and starting with the most simple way to do that. If you're a really visual person, with the GPS overlay is what I always suggest. That's the least intimidating way to start looking at your data and having those thoughts, because if you develop that proper thing, kind of Socratic thought process, the Eric Meyer way of asking questions.
Yep.
That's what I would call the Socratic process. Then you can really start to unpack, why am I doing this? Why does the data look this way? And you can come up with a plan to go challenge it. So yeah, exactly to your point, even though that, I hadn't been able to race, wheel to wheel in a while, and really been in a situation where my goal is to push the car to the limit and go to the front. I was, really able to try the things that I wanted to try. I wasn't really thinking as much about actually driving the car as I was thinking about, why is the car doing this? What if I try this and do this differently? What's that going to make the data look like? And then kind of in my head, I'm kind of drawing a speed trace or a brake pressure trace or a steering input trace, and just to see, kind of visually what it looks like if I try braking differently. What does the brake trace look like? And that kind of gives me a visual reference of how I should change it, I guess, if that makes sense. But it all comes down to understanding why. And, for folks listening that, your career, your job, what your passion, whatever you enjoy, that's not racing, or what your passion was before you got into racing, because now you're probably totally hooked like the rest of us. But think about, how, when you got really good at it, what were you thinking about and what were you focused on? And I'm willing to bet when you really truly understand something, it's because you understand why what's happening is happening. You understand kind of that most foundational component.
So as we kind of get close to wrapping this up, I didn't prepare you for this, but I was going to ask, what is your speed secret? That one piece of advice, and I'm kind of just sitting there going, maybe you just said it, but what's the one piece of advice, your speed secret for listeners?
I'm gonna have to make sure I'm not saying the same thing I've said on the previous 2 shows.
Well, they're so long ago. Who cares, right?
Yeah, who cares?
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure one of them was find your why. So I might,
okay.
That's definitely that's probably the most foundational thing. Why are you doing what you're doing? And maybe I'll stick with the data route, because that's what I spend most of my time looking at. But I would say take. My speed secret right now, while you're not able to go to the racetrack, is if you have data, or you don't have data, shoot me an email or ask somebody on a forum or a Facebook group to get you some data, and get really, really familiar with the software. That's a really simple speed secret, but the first barrier to understanding your data is being comfortable with what you're using, so you can actually get something out of it. You can't expect to, not know how to view the speed trace. You can't expect to learn from the speed trace if you don't know how to view it. And, while systems are getting simpler and easier to use, there's, if you learn how to do that now and make it muscle memory, when you go back to the track, you'll be super surprised what you're able to learn in 10 minutes between sessions. So that's my speed secret. Was we covered it earlier in the show, but learn your data software while you can't go to the track, while you're sitting at home.
Okay, awesome. How do people connect with you?
You can shoot me an email if you want some sample Apex Pro data at apextrackcoach.com. I'm happy to send you something, and then follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. If you search Apex Pro, it's also the name of a keyboard, but you'll probably find us. Official Apex Pro is our tag on Facebook and Instagram, and then Apex Pro on YouTube.
Okay, I will make sure those links get put into the show notes as well. But hey, Andrew, thank you so much for being back on the show again. And I don't know, you're gonna say you're gonna probably start to challenge. I think Colin might be the guy that I've had on the show most, because we did so many shows while we were traveling around Europe together a couple of years ago that, but you're going to challenge him pretty soon here, being my most popular, most consistent guest on the show. So thanks
that's a privilege and an honor right there. I don't know if I can compete with Colin.
Well, I don't know of too many who can compete with him in terms of going faster on a racetrack, but your input, your ideas, your thoughts, and what you talked about today, specifically about the use of data and how to dig into the why part of that. And then, for those who are instructors, maybe how to use that as well. I think super, super valuable. So yeah, thanks absolutely again for being on the show.
Well, thank you. And definitely, I know you've got some data resources available through your stuff. I've taken your beginner data course, the webinar. I've anything that you have published that's data related, I've tried to consume. So I appreciate what you do, because it's certainly helped me a whole lot.
We all share, and that's the best part. So the only thing that I don't want any sharing right now is this whole virus deal. So people listening, hopefully we're getting through this, and but stay healthy. And Andrew, stay healthy, stay away from people. The good thing is we're socially distant right now. And
very, yeah. 2,000 plus miles.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's far enough. But hopefully you get back on track soon. And as usual, keep learning and having fun.
Same to you. Thanks.
If you have a burning question about racing or high-performance driving, then head to speedsecrets.com and check out the Ask Ross column. Every week, Ross answers a question, the one you may be wondering about right now. And if your question has not been answered already, zap Ross an email at info@speedsecrets.com. He will add it to the list, and your question will be published on the Speed Secrets website. Ask away at info@speedsecrets.com.